Ethan Cole had one of the strangest ways of making money that has ever existed. Every single drop of sweat that left his body put $1 into his bank account. At first that sounded almost useless. $1 is not a life. $1 is a bus fare, most of a coffee, a third of a sandwich. When he understood what had happened to him, his honest first reaction was disappointment. Then he realized something very simple. There was no limit on how much a person is allowed to sweat. He was 26 years old. He worked in the accounts department of a company that resold industrial fasteners, which is exactly as interesting as it sounds. He had a one-bedroom flat with a window that faced a brick wall, a radiator that only worked in the summer, and a bank balance that had spent 2 years hovering somewhere between $400 and $1,100 without ever once making a serious attempt at either direction. He was not poor in the dramatic sense. Nobody was going to make a film about it. He was poor in the ordinary, grinding, forgettable way that most people are poor, where nothing is ever quite an emergency and nothing is ever quite fine. He was also, on the morning this happened, extremely late. The bus left as he came around the corner. He saw it go. He had that half second where you decide whether to run, and he made the wrong choice, which was to run. Ethan was not a runner. He had the general physical condition of a man who took the lift to the second floor. 400 meters in, his lungs had opinions. 600 meters in, his shirt had gone dark down the middle of his back, and he had accepted that he was going to be late anyway and was now simply running out of momentum and embarrassment. That was when the first drop of sweat came off his forehead, and a small rectangle of pale blue light appeared in the air in front of him. He stopped so hard he nearly went over. The rectangle stayed exactly where it was, floating at eye level, perfectly readable, tilted very slight to want him as though it wanted to be helpful. Inside it were 4 words and a number: sweat detected, plus $1. Ethan stood on the pavement, breathing hard, and did what any sane person does when reality stops working correctly. He checked his phone. His phone had no notifications. His phone was in his pocket and had been the entire time. He took it out anyway, held it up, turned it over, and looked at the floating blue rectangle over the top of it. Because some part of his brain was still insisting that this was a very good advertisement. Another drop ran down his temple and fell. Plus $1. The number in the box ticked over too. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, which was a mistake, because the hand was also covered in sweat. And about 6 drops came off his wrist and hit the pavement at once. Plus $6. The counter said 8. Ethan opened his banking app. He had checked his bank balance perhaps 4,000 times in his life, and had never once been surprised by it. He knew the number before it loaded. He always knew the number. The number was $8 high, the number he knew. He stood very still on a pavement on a Tuesday morning and read the same line of text about 9 times. Then he ran around the block. He did not decide to do it. He would later be quite clear about this. There was no moment of deliberation, no weighing of options. Some deep and completely uneducated part of him had performed a piece of arithmetic and taken control of his legs before the rest of him had caught up. The first loop took him 4 minutes, and he was destroyed by the end of it. He hung onto a lamp post outside a shuttered dry cleaners and dripped onto his own shoes and watched number climb 14, 19, 23. The drops came off his chin, his nose, his hairline, his forearms. Every one of them was $1. Every one was real. The blue box counted them without any apparent effort, patiently, like it had all day. He did loop again. Slower. It didn't seem to matter. By the time he stopped, properly stopped, sat down on a low wall, and put his head between his knees, because the world had gone slightly grey edges, the box read $37. $37. For 20 minutes of being profoundly unfit in public, Ethan sat on the wall for a long time. He was 2 hours late for work by then, and he found, examining his feelings honestly, that he did not care even slightly. He called in sick. He had never once called in sick when he was not sick. The lie came out smooth and easy, and he hung up and looked at his hands, which were shaking, and which had produced $11 on their own. Then he went home and started testing. The rest of that day, Ethan Cole conducted the least scientific and most important experiments of his life. He ran the stairs of his building, 6 floors up and down, until his legs stopped answering. That was $91. He did press-ups on his living room floor until his arms gave out, which took an amount of time his never to tell anyone. $28. He put on his coat and a jumper and sat in front of the radiator, which was working because it's July. He got warm, then hot, then genuinely unwell, and produced a slow, steady trickle of sweat for about 40 minutes. That was worth $12. He sat there, cooking, with $12, and had his first suspicion that this was going to be more complicated than he had hoped. Because the maths was wrong. He had sweated far more in front of the radiator than he had doing press-ups. He was certain of it. He had been sitting in a puddle, and the press-ups had paid more than twice as much. He filed away. He didn't understand it yet. He would spend a considerable portion of the next year understanding it. By 11 o'clock that night, Ethan had earned $246 without leaving his postcode. He sat on his kitchen floor with the fridge door open against his back, drinking his fourth glass of water, and looked at the number. $246 in one day, from nothing, from a body that had, up till this morning, been an expense. His rent was $1,180 a month. He did the division. Anyone would have done the division. He did it 3 times, because the first 2 times he got an answer he didn't trust. 5 days. If he could do that every day, his rent took 5 days. And that was the point where the thought arrived. The real one. The one that changed the shape of his entire life, and that he would think about, much later, with a certain amount of respect and a certain amount of horror. $246 was what he had made by accident, by running badly, by sitting near a radiator, by doing press-ups until he fell over, which had taken a grand total of 6 minutes, because he 26 years old and had the physical capacity of a filing cabinet. He had not trained for this. He had not prepared. He had made $246 being, by any reasonable measure, terrible at it. So the question was not how much money he could make. The question was how much better at this he could get. Ethan Cole closed the fridge, stood up in his empty kitchen, and looked at the small blue box that had been following him patiently around all day, waiting for him to work it out. Tomorrow, he thought, I find out what my actual limit is. It would take him 4 days to find it. It would take him considerably longer to find out what happens when you go past it. The next morning, Ethan Cole did not go to work either. He had $410 in his account, and a question that would not let him sleep. And those 2 things together were worth more than a day of reconciling invoices. The question was, when exactly counts? Because if the answer was sweat, then he needed to know what the system thought sweat was. And there was one obvious way to cheat it. And he wanted to find out in his own bathroom, rather than out in the world, where it might matter. He filled a glass with water. He stood in front of the mirror. He poured it over his own head. The water ran down his face, off his chin, off his jaw, onto the tiles. 6, 7, 8 drops, more. The panel said foreign water detected. The number did not move. Ethan stood there dripping, and to his own mild surprise, felt relieved rather than disappointed. If pouring a glass of water on his head had worked, then the ability was a glitch, and glitches get patched. This was a rule, rules he could work with. He spent the rest of the morning finding the edges. Rain did not count. He stood in the shower with the water running and produced nothing but a foreign water detected notice that he came to find faintly patronizing. He tried mixing salt into a spray bottle, on the theory that the system was chemically checking, and got the same 3 words. He tried wringing out a wet shirt over his own arm. Nothing. He tried, in a moment he chose never to describe to anybody, licking the back of his own hand. Nothing. The system was not detecting salt water on skin. It was detecting his sweat glands doing work. It knew the difference between something happening to his body and something his body was doing. That was worth knowing. Then he opened a spreadsheet. Because Ethan Cole worked in accounts, and there was never any real chance he was going to approach this any other way. 6 colony time, drops, multiplier, earnings per hour, fatigue, 1 to 10. He would later show a version of that spreadsheet to a room of investors, and the room would find it very funny, and he would not entirely understand why. He started at the bottom of the effort ladder and worked up. Sitting still in a warm room, minutes. Almost nothing. Standing in direct sunlight on the pavement outside his building. 30 minutes, a slow trickle, $11, and a conversation with a neighbor who wanted to know if he was all right. Wearing his winter coat indoors again, which he already knew about, and which he logged anyway, because that was the point of a spreadsheet. Then a hot shower with the door shut and the extractor off, which produced a genuinely alarming of sweat and $19. Then a bowl of the hottest curry the place on the corner would sell him, eaten as fast as he could manage, which produced sweat on his scalp and his upper lip and $31 and a fairly severe reckoning about 2 hours later. Then walking, then jogging, then running. By 4 in the afternoon he had a spreadsheet with 14 rows in it, and a pattern he did not like. The pattern was that the amount of sweat and the amount of money were not the same shape. He kept coming back to it. The curry had produced perhaps a fifth of the sweat that the hot shower had. It had paid nearly twice as much. The winter coat had soaked him through and paid $12. 11 minutes of running had paid $44. He did not have the vocabulary for it yet. What he had was a spreadsheet where one column refused to correlate with the other, and Ethan had spent 4 years being paid to notice exactly that kind of thing. So on the third day, he went to a sauna, because if the pattern was going to break anywhere, it break there. He paid $18 for a day pass at a leisure center, where nobody would recognize him, and sat in a cedar box at 90 degrees with a towel over his knees. And he sweated the way a person sweats in a sauna, which is enormously. It ran off him. It pooled on the bench. It came off his elbows in a steady drip. Ethan sat in the middle of the greatest concentration of his own perspiration that he had ever produced, that did arithmetic in his head, and got very, very excited. Because this was it. This was the exploit. You did not have to work. You did not have to hurk. You just had to sit in a hot room and let your body run like a tap, and you could do it for hours. And you could do it every single day, and there was no ceiling on it at all. He gave it 40 minutes. He came out shaking and gray and euphoric and checked the panel. Passive effort penalty. Times 0.1. $22. Ethan sat down on a plastic bench in a leisure center changing room, wrapped in a towel, and looked $22 for a very long time. 40 minutes in a sauna. 40 minutes of the most sweat he had ever produced in his life. $22. 11 minutes of running badly around a block on the first morning, before he understood anything at all, had paid $44. He got dressed. He went outside. It was raining slightly, and he did not care. He put his bag against a wall and he ran in jeans in the rain until he had to stop. 9 minutes. $51. And there it was. Not a glitch, not an error, not a quirk of the sauna. A rule, sitting there in plain sight, that he had been looking at for 3 days without seeing. The system was not paying him for sweat. It was paying him for effort. Sweat was just the receipt. A sauna makes you sweat by doing something to you. You sit there and heat does the work and your body responds. Nothing is asked of you. The system had a number for that, and the number was 0.1, and the number was an insult. Running makes you sweat because you are doing something. It costs. It hurts a little, or a lot. The system had numbers for that too, and they went the other way. Ethan walked home in wet jeans in the dark and understood, with total clarity, that the thing he had given was not a money printer. It was a machine that paid him precisely as much as he was willing to suffer. Which was, he thought, letting himself into a flat that smelled of curry and wet coat, a considerably worse gift than he had believed on Tuesday. And also, if he was honest with himself, a considerably more interesting one. He opened the spreadsheet and added a 15th column, and this one he titled Multiplier, and for the first time he sorted by it instead of by earnings. The sauna sat at the bottom of the list where it belonged. He looked at the top of the list, which said running, and he thought about how bad he was at running. And he thought about the fact that a man who could run for an hour would earn what a man who could 9 minutes earned, several times over. Then he thought about it the other way round, which was the thought that actually mattered. If the multiplier went up with effort, and effort was measured against what his body could currently do, then every single week that he got fitter, running would pay him less. He would have to keep going, not to earn more, to earn the same. Ethan sat in his kitchen with a spreadsheet open and understood the shape of the next several years of his life, and he was not, at that point, frightened by it at all. That would come later. Ethan went back to work on the Thursday, and that turned out to be the last ordinary month of his life. He had decided something in the kitchen with the spreadsheet open, and the decision was this. He was not going to quit his job on a hunch. He had $1,180 of rent every month, and no savings worth the word. And a floating blue rectangle was not, whatever else it might be, a contract. So he kept the job, and he built the running around it. He got up at 5. That was the first change, and it nearly ended the whole project. because Ethan Cole had never voluntarily seen 5 in the morning in his adult life. He ran for 20 minutes in the dark badly, and came back and stood in the shower feeling like something scraped off a road. That first structured week he averaged $140 a day, which was, he had to admit, less than he had made on the chaotic Tuesday when he had no idea what he was doing. There was a reason, and it took him 4 days to see it. On the Tuesday he had thrashed himself. He had run until he nearly passed out, done press-ups until his arms quit, and cooked himself on coat. Every one of those was maximum effort against a body that had never done anything, and the system had paid accordingly. Now he was training sensibly, 20 minutes at a pace he could hold. The system looked at that and saw a man comfortably within himself, and priced it like one. $140 a day was $4,200 a month. His salary, after tax, was $2,700. Ethan sat with that for a while. He was, as of the second week, making more from running before breakfast than from the job he had spent 4 years getting mildly good at. And he did not quit, because $140 a day was also a number that could stop. And he had watched enough people be certain about money to be careful about it. He gave himself a rule. He would not resign until the ability had paid him more than a year of salary. Not projected, actually paid, sitting in the account. Then he set about making that happen faster. He read about running the way he would have researched a supplier. Properly, with tabs open, cadence, heel strike. What a tempo run was. Why everybody kept saying zone 2. He learned that his shins hurt because he was running in shoes he had owned since university and doing far too much far too soon. Which was true in a way the article did not intend. He bought proper shoes, $210, which 4 weeks earlier would have been event. He added a second session. Lunchtime, 30 minutes in a park 9 minutes from the office, sandwich eaten at his desk with hair still wet. Then a third, running the 6 kilometers home instead of taking the bus, which took him an hour with walking breaks he was privately ashamed of. By week 5 he was clearing $380 on a good day. The jump did not come from running longer. It came from running harder, from discovering that the same 40 minutes, done at a pace that genuinely hurt, paid nearly triple what it paid at a pace that did not. He put a column in the spreadsheet for perceived effort, 1 to 10, and it correlated within tightly than distance did. More tightly than time did, more tightly than anything else he had measured. The system was not paying for the run, it was paying for the cost of the run. By week 9, running 90 minutes at a time without stopping, he was clearing $900 a day. And this is where he noticed the thing that would define the rest of it. Week 9's 90-minute run paid $900. Week 10's identical 90-minute run, same route, same pace, same weather, paid $760. He had not done anything wrong. He had simply got better at it. The run had cost him less, so the system had paid him less. He checked the panel and the multiplier had moved down, not by much, by enough. He stood in his kitchen at 7:30 in the morning with that number and understood, properly, a machine he was inside. It was not a machine that rewarded fitness. It was a machine that rewarded difficulty, and it measured difficulty against whatever he happened to be capable of that week, and it recalculated constantly, and without sentiment. To stand still, he had to keep climbing, which meant the only way this ever paid more was if it always hurt about the same. By week 14 he was running 4 sessions a day and lifting in the afternoons. Because he had found that lifting to failure paid nearly as well as running, and used different parts of him. Which meant he could earn twice in a day, without either one destroying him. $2,100, then $2,004, then on a cold Thursday in the rain, $2,960. $51,000 in the account. He resigned on a Friday. He gave 4 weeks' notice, because it seemed wrong not to, and worked all 4 of them. And on his last day somebody bought a supermarket cake and 11 people sang. And Ethan stood there holding a paper plate, thinking about the fact that he had earned the cost of the cake during the singing. They asked what he was moving on to. He said he was going into fitness. Which was, he reflected on the bus home, one of the more truthful lies ever told. Then he was unemployed and comfortable and had nothing at all to do except the thing. This is where it got strange. Because a man with a job who runs 3 times a day is a man with a demanding hobby. A man with no job who runs 4 times a day is something else, and Ethan discovered inside a Fordna that the ability had not given him freedom. It had given him a shift: awake at 5, because cold and early paid best, run until 9. Eat, sleep an hour, run again at 11. Lift in the afternoon. Run again in the evening. In bed by 9:30 because he had to be up at 5. 5 hours of actual work a day. Between $2,000 and $3,000. He did the arithmetic on a Sunday, because he could not stop himself. Somewhere near 900,000 a year. If nothing changed, something would change. The multiply would keep sliding. He knew that now. The flat by then had started to change in ways he had not decided on. 4 pairs of running shoes by the door in rotation, because a pair does not dry overnight. A clothes horse permanently open in the living room and a second one in the bedroom. The washing machine running twice a day, every day, making a sound he was choosing not to investigate. 7 identical gray t-shirts, because owning identical kit removed a decision, and removing a decision saved 4 minutes, and 4 minutes was worth about $90 now. And there was a smell. Ethan did not notice it. This is the important part. He genuinely, entirely did not notice it, for what would eventually turn out to have been about 9 days. It was his upstairs neighbor who mentioned it, in the way people mention things they have been building up to for a while. Which is to say, suddenly and slightly too loudly, on a landing, holding a bag of recycling. She asked, very carefully, whether something might have died in his flat. Ethan said no, and went inside, and stood in his own hallway, and made himself breathe in proper the first time in over a week. And discovered that the most profitable 4 months of his life had produced a small 1-bedroom apartment that smelled, unmistakably and catastrophically, like the inside of a gym bag left in a car in August. There is a thing nobody tells you about sweating for a living, which is that the sweat does not stop when you do. Ethan learned this over about 6 weeks, in stages, each one slightly more humiliating than the last. The flat was the first front. He bought a second washing machine. Not a bigger one, a second one. Installed beside the first by a man who asked no questions and clearly had several. They ran in shifts. Between them they did 11 loads a week, and the flat developed a permanent background hum that Ethan stopped hearing inside a fortnight. He bought 30 gray t-shirts. 30. The delivery came in 1 box, and the driver made a uniform, and Ethan laughed politely. Because the honest answer was yes. He changed shirts 4 times a day and it was not enough. The problem was not hygiene. Ethan showered 3 times a day, sometimes 4. He was, in the strict sense, one of the cleanest men in the city. The problem was that he was producing 4 or 5 liters of sweat a day into a 1-bedroom, 1 small window. And no amount of showering addressed the fabric, the carpet, the shoes, the walls, the towels, the air. The neighbor's question had been the polite version. The second front was other people, and it opened at a friend's birthday. Ethan arrived straight from a run, having done the arithmetic on going home to change, and decided that 40 minutes of travel was $200 of not running. He had showered at the leisure center. He had put on a clean shirt. He believed, sincerely, that he was fine. He walked into a small, warm, crowded bar and watched a bubble form around himself. It was not dramatic. Nobody said anything. It was just that the people nearest him drifted, in 1s and 2s, with excellent excuses, and did not drift back. And by 10 o'clock Ethan Cole was standing in a corner of his friend's birthday, with 2 feet of clear space. Around him in a room where nobody else had 6 inches. He went home early. He earned $400 on the walk. After that it escalated the way these things do, which is to say into farce. A lift in an office building he was visiting emptied at the 2nd floor. All 4 people. 2 of them took the stairs down from the 2nd floor, which is a thing a person only does for a reason. A taxi driver put every window down in November, and drove the whole way with his head slightly turned toward the gap, and refused a tip, which Ethan found genuinely hurtful. A restaurant opened a window in a room that had not had a window open all winter. And the waiter did it, while looking straight ahead in a manner that suggested he had been asked to, did not want to be seen doing it. His oldest friend, Dev, who had known him since they were 19 and had never in 15 years been anything other than direct, stood beside Ethan's car with his hand on the door handle, did not open it, and said, "Mate, I'll walk." It was Dev who eventually said the thing out loud, because somebody had to and everybody else had chosen not to. They were in a park. Dev had suggested the park, and Ethan had understood why, and had gone anyway. Dev said, "I don't know what's going on with you. You've lost about 11 kilos. You've quit a job you were fine at. You won't say what you're doing. and you smell like a horse that's been left in a garage. If you're in trouble, I would like to be told. Ethan sat on a bench in a park with the best friend he had in the world and understood that there was no version of the truth that did not sound like a breakdown. So he said he'd got into endurance training. He said he was doing well. He said he was sorry about the smell and that he was working on it. 2 of those 3 things were true. Dev looked at him for a while and said all right, and did not believe him, and let it go. And something small went out of the friendship that afternoon that would take Ethan about 2 years to notice was missing. He tried after that. He tried very hard. He bought deodorant in quantities that got him a message from a supermarket about unusual activity. He tried the clinical stuff you get behind the counter. He tried the industrial stuff sold to people who work in foundries. He tried an aluminum compound that a forum swore by and which turned out to be for horses, which he decided not to think about too closely given Dev's comment. None of it worked, and it took him a while to understand why. Antiperspirant works by blocking the ducts. Blocking the ducts stops the sweat. Stopping the sweat stopped the money. Ethan stood in a bathroom holding a bottle of something rated for industrial use, and worked out they had just spent $40 on a product whose entire function was to reduce his income, and started laughing and could not stop for some time. That was the joke, and it was the joke the whole way through, and it never once stopped being the joke. Everything that made him money made him unbearable to be near. Every solution to being unbearable to be near cost him money. He did the sums because of course he did. A 90-minute run paid about $1,100. A social evening cost him a session, which was $1,100, and cost the people around him something they were too polite to itemize. Once he had written it down like that, in a column, it stopped being a dilemma and became a calculation, and Ethan Cole was extremely good at calculations. He stopped going to things, not dramatically, nobody was told. He simply began having reasons, and the reasons were good, and there were always more of them. And after a while the invitations thinned out the way invitations do when they stop being accepted. And then they stopped. And he did not really notice the month in which the last one arrived. He ran instead. He ran in the mornings when the streets were empty, and in the evenings when they were empty again, 11 at night, when there was nobody in the park at all. And the running was excellent, and the money was excellent, and there was nobody within 200 meters of him for most of it. The system did not have an opinion about this. The system paid the same whether he was alone or not. It would take him a long time, years, and a great deal of money, and one very bad night in a hospital, to work out that this was the first real thing it had cost him, and that unlike everything else, it had never once shown up on the panel. There was no line for it. He got the achievement in October, on a Tuesday, halfway up a hill, personal space. Awarded, the panel explained, for maintaining a 2-meter radius of unoccupied ground for 3 consecutive days in a public place. Ethan stood on the hill and read it twice. The system, it turned out, had noticed. It had been keeping track. It had given the thing a name and a number and filed it as an accomplishment. And somewhere in whatever passed for its judgment it had decided that this was worth celebrating. He laughed. He was genuinely alone on the hill, so nobody heard it. Then he finished the run, because the multiplier was good in the cold, and it was getting cold now. And he had recently begun to suspect that winter was going to be worth an enormous amount of money. Winter was worth an enormous amount of money, and that is what nearly killed him. Ethan had worked out by the middle of November that cold weather paid roughly triple. Not because he sweated more, he sweated far less. But because producing sweat at all, when the air is at 2 degrees, requires the body to be working genuinely hard. And the system priced that accordingly. A 90-minute run in July had paid $1,100. The same run in a December sleet paid $3,200. So he ran in December. He ran in the mornings when it was dark and the pavements had ice at the edges. And he ran at night when it was colder still, and he added a 5th session. And then on the 11th of December, he did something he had never done before, which was to skip the gap between sessions entirely. He had noticed a number, lifetime earnings, the panel called it. It sat at the bottom of every readout, and he had watched it climb for 5 months, without particularly caring. And on the morning of the 11th it read $941,000. 59,000 from $1 million. Ethan looked at that for a while over a coffee he did not finish, and made a decision that seemed at the time entirely reasonable. which was that he would rather like to see it happen today. 59,000 was about 4 sessions, maybe 5. It was a long day, but it was a day. He started at 6 in the morning. The first hydration warning came at 11. Hydration 42%. He read it, drank most of a bottle of water, and kept running. Because 42% did not sound like an emergency, and because the number he actually cared about had moved to 968,000. He ate at 1, standing up, and went out again. The second warning came at 4 in the afternoon. Hydration 21%. This one he did notice, because the panel had gone a different color, and because his hands had started to feel odd. A sort of distant tingling that he attributed to the cold. He drank a liter and a half of water in about 90 seconds, which felt like the responsible thing to do, and which he would later learn was very nearly the worst available option. Because water alone at that point does not fix the problem. It dilutes what is left. He went out again at 5, into the dark. He was at 901,000. $9,000. 3/4 of an hour, at cold weather rates, less if he pushed. He pushed. The third warning came somewhere around the 7-kilometer mark, and he did not read it properly, because his vision had developed a strange shimmer at the edges. Like heat haze, which was absurd, because it was 3 degrees. Hydration 9%. His legs were still working. That was the thing he remembered afterwards, and the thing that frightened him most in retrospect. His legs were completely fine. There was no warning from his body that he recognized as a warning. There was a shimmer, and a sort of ringing, and a peculiar feeling of enormous calm and competence, and the certain knowledge that he was about to become a millionaire on a towpath. He remembered the panel going red. He did not remember the last 400 meters, and he never did. Ethan Cole woke up in a hospital at 20 past 2 in the morning with a cannula in the back of a sail, and a bag of saline going into him, and a doctor asking him, with the flat patience of somebody who has asked it before, whether he had taken anything. He said no. She asked what he had been doing. He said running. She said for how long. He worked it out, and told her, and watched her face change, and understood that he had said something much worse than he intended. He had been running on and off for 19.5 hours. He had drunk about 6 liters of water and eaten twice. His sodium was low enough that she used the word dangerous, and then, when he did not react to correctly, used a longer sentence containing the word seizure. A man walking his dog had found him on the towpath. He had been face down and unresponsive for somewhere between 4 and 20 minutes. Nobody can narrow it further. It was December. It was 3 degrees. He had been lying on wet concrete in soaked clothing. The doctor did not say the word hypothermia, but she did explain, quite carefully, what would have happened if the dot had not gone over. Ethan lay in a hospital bed and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then, because he could not stop himself, he looked at the panel. Lifetime earnings $1,140,000. He had made it. He had crossed the million somewhere, in the 400 meters, he could not remember, and there a band achievement, and he had not been conscious to see it. Ethan Cole read that number in a hospital bed at 3 in the morning with a needle in his hand. And for the first time since a floating rectangle had appeared on a pavement in July, he felt genuinely, properly afraid. Not of the system. The system had told him. It had told him 3 times, in plain language, with numbers, and the last time it had gone red. He was afraid of the fact that he had read all 3 warnings and had, on each occasion, correctly understood them and chosen to continue. There was nothing wrong with the machine. He was discharged the next afternoon with a leaflet about electrolytes and an instruction to see his own doctor. And he went home and slept for 14 hours. And when he woke up, he made himself a promise, which he articulated out loud in an empty flat, which was that he was never going to do that again. He meant it entirely. He kept it for 11 weeks. What broke it was not greed, exactly. It was that he got better at hydrating and the ceiling moved. He learned about sodium. He learned about potassium and magnesium, and he bought the powders and he weighed them. And he built protocol. And the protocol worked. For a while, at a certain volume of training, in certain weather. And then the multiplier slid, the way it always slid. And to earn what he had earned in December, he had to do more than he had done in December. And the protocol had been built for December. The second collapse was in March and it was less dramatic. He got himself to a bench. He did not lose consciousness. He sat with his head between his knees for 40 minutes while a stranger fetched him a sports from a garage and he was fine, and he went home. The third was in May, and it was worse than the first. He woke up in the same hospital, on a different ward, and he did not need to be told what had happened. And the panel was waiting for him when he opened his eyes. Achievement unlocked. Dry as a desert. Reach critical dehydration 3 times. Reward hydration shop unlocked. Ethan lay there with a drip in his arm for the second time in 5 months, reading the words hydration shop, and said out loud, to an empty bay, in a voice that came out considerably angrier than he expected, "You could have given me this the first time." The panel did not answer. It never answered. But he understood, lying there, something about the thing he was dealing with that he had not fully accepted before. It was not a partner. It was not a benefactor. It had never once lied to him, and it had never once helped him. It was a machine that paid out on suffering. And it had just proved that it would let him nearly die 3 separate times before it handed to the tool that would have prevented all 3. Because the tool was a reward, and rewards have requirements, and the requirement was that he suffer enough to earn it. The hydration shop was a list. That was all it was. Ethan had been expecting something, a storefront, an interface, some flourish. And what he got was a plain column of items hanging in the air above his hospital blanket. Priced in the only currency he had, hydration gel, $400. He bought one. Because he was lying in a bed with a drip in his arm, and the irony was too good to pass up. And a small weight appeared in his hand. An actual object, a foil sachet cold, with nothing written on it. He drank it. Within about 90 seconds he felt the specific relief of being properly hydrated, which is a thing you only recognize when it arrives. And he lay there and understood that the machine had just charged him $400 to solve a problem it had spent 5 months creating. He bought 6 more. By the end of that week, Ethan had spent $11,000 in a shop that had not existed a fortnight earlier, and had begun to grasp that the ability had just changed shape again. The consumables were the obvious part. Hydration gel for during a session. Electrolyte concentrate, 1200, which did in one mouthful what is home. Weighed powder Kalhan, done badly over an hour. Recovery drink, 2000, which compressed the useless dead time after a hard session from 4 hours to about 40 minutes. That last one was the first thing he bought that genuinely frightened him, and it frightened him because of what it implied. Because the limit had never been his legs. The limit had been recovery. A body can do 2 hard sessions a day, and then it needs the rest of the day to become a body again. And no amount of wanting changes that. Recovery drink changed it. $2,000 a bottle, and he could do a 3rd session. The 3rd session paid $11,000. Ethan sat with that arithmetic for a long time, because it had a shape he recognized from work. He was not being sold a product. He was being sold capacity, at a margin, by the only supplier there was. Then he found the 2nd tab, and the 2nd tab was worse. Permanent upgrades, hydration capacity 1, $40,000. His body would hold more water, lose it more slowly, and tolerate the loss better. Not a consumable, not a boost. A change to him, forever, for $40,000. Ethan read that 4 times and then he bought it, and there was no ceremony at all. A brief warmth across his chest and back and it was done, and he was, permanently, a slightly different animal than he had been that morning. Hydration capacity 2 was 160,000. Hydration capacity 3 was 600,000. He worked out the pattern immediately, because it was the pattern he had spent 4 years, Recontier cost, roughly 4 times the last. And each one bought a smaller improvement than the one before it. Diminishing returns priced by something that understood diminishing returns perfectly well. He bought capacity 2 in June. He bought water retention efficiency in July, which cost 90,000, and many could train for 5 hours in the heat on the fluid that had previously carried him 3. He bought electrolyte stability in August, which cost 220,000, and quietly removed the cramps that had been waking the morning, for a month without his connecting the two. By September he had spent $1,400,000 on his own body, and his lifetime earnings were $3,100,000. And his effective training day had gone from 2 or 3 serious hours to more than 8. 8 hours, 6 sessions. He was earning between $9,000 and $14,000 a day. And here is the thing that Ethan noticed in September. Sitting on the floor of a flat he still had not moved out of. Eating chicken out of a plastic tub at 11 at night. The upgrades did not make it easier. They made it possible to do more, which meant he did more. which meant that the 8-hour day hurt exactly as much at the end as the 3-hour day had in March. He had spent $1.4 million and arrived back at precisely the same sensation. He had bought a bigger ceiling and moved straight up to it. He put his fork down and laughed at the ceiling of a rented flat and thought, of course. Of course that is how this works. The system does not sell relief. It has never once sold relief. It sells the ability to suffer more efficiently, and it charges by the tier. He bought advanced thermal regulation in October anyway. $380,000. There was one other thing in the shop that autumn, sitting near the bottom of the list without explanation, grayed out and unpriced. Sweat counter HD, he could afford. Anti-chafing skin, which sounded absurd and turned out best purchase he ever made, he bought immediately. Enhanced tendons and joint reinforcement he bought in November after his left knee started making a sound on stairs. But the grade 1 had no price and no description, just a name, sweat compression. He asked the panel about it, which he had never done before and which felt faintly ridiculous, standing in a kitchen talking to a rectangle. The panel told him it was locked. He asked what unlocked it. And the panel, which had never volunteered anything, which had answered 3 warnings and then let him fall on a towpath, gave him a number, 1 million drop. Ethan stood in his kitchen with a fork in his hand and worked out that he was, as of that evening, at 410,000. He did not know what sweat compression was. He had no idea what it did. It sat at the bottom of a list, grayed out, behind a number he was less than halfway to. He looked at it for a while. Then he went and got his shoes, at 11:20 at night, in November, and went out and did another session. Because 600,000 drops is a lot of drops, and there was no possible reason to start tomorrow. The problem with getting good at something is that you stop being bad at it. Ethan had understood this in principle since week 10. He understood it very differently on a Tuesday in January when he ran his standard morning 90 minutes. A route he had run 400 times. In weather he had run it in before. And the panel paid him $4,100. 6 weeks earlier the same run had paid $7,200. He had not slowed down. He had not skipped anything. He had simply become, over 6 weeks, a man for whom 90 minutes at that pace was no longer difficult. And the system had noticed and adjusted, and there was no appeal. He stood in the road at 7:30 in the morning and did the only calculation available. To earn what he had earned in November, he would have to run about 2 hours and 40 minutes. To earn what he wanted to earn, he would have to run 4. There are not enough hours. That was the wall, and he hit it that January. And everything he did for the next 18 months was a response to it. The answer, when he found it, was embarrassingly simple. If the multiplier is a ratio between what a task costs and what your body can do, then you can attack it from either side. Getting weaker was not available. Making the task cost more was. He bought a weighted vest in the last week of January, 5 kilos. He put it on and ran his standard route, and it was, in a way that surprised him with its immediacy, hard again. 5 kilos 90 minutes, $6,800. He had bought back November for $110 of nylon and steel shot. Ethan went home and sat down and had the first genuinely strategic thought of the entire enterprise, which was that he had been thinking about this completely the wrong way round. He had been trying to get fitter so he could do more. But fitness was the thing devaluing him. Fitness depreciation. What he actually needed was to stay permanently at the edge of his own capacity, and to move that edge outward only as fast as he could add difficulty to compensate. He needed, in other words, to be exactly as unfit as he could survive being. 10 kilos in February, 20 in April. At 20 kilos the vest stopped being a vest and started being a project. He had to relearn how to run. His stride changed. His knees complained until the joint reinforcement upgrade sorted it. He went through 3 pairs of shoes in 5 weeks and discovered that the sole of a running shoe is not designed for a man who weighs 98 kilos and did not last week. 20 kilos, 90 minutes, in April rain $19,400. 40 kilos by August, and by then he had stopped being able to buy the equipment off a shelf. The vests that go past 25 are made for a small number of very specific people, and even has built by a company in Leeds that normally supplied military training units. The man who took the order asked, on the phone, in a tone of professional curiosity, what it was for. Ethan said endurance work. The man said, what kind of endurance work needs 40 kilos? Ethan said the profitable kind, and laughed, and did not ask again. The strangest part of that year was not the training. It was that other people had begun to notice him, and had reached a conclusion, and the conclusion was completely wrong. He walked to a shop in August wearing 40 kilos, because walking to a shop in 40 kilos paid $100, and walking to a shop in nothing paid $4. A man outside a cafe watched him come the whole length of the street and then said, not unkindly, as he passed, "Mate, why?" And Ethan, who had by then answered variations of this perhaps 30 times, and had developed a sound because the truth was unavailable, said efficiency. He kept walking. Behind him he heard the man say something to a companion, and both of them laughed, and it was the good kind of laugh. That single word did more damage to the rest of his life than any decision he made deliberately. Because a woman at a table outside that cafe had filmed the last 9 seconds of it, and put it online with a caption that read, "Ask this man why he's wearing a fridge," and he said EFSENCY, and by Thursday it had 400,000 views. Ethan did not know for 11 days. He found out because Dev sent it to him with no message attached, which was, from Dev, an entire paragraph. He watched himself walk up a street under 40 kilos of ballast, with a completely neutral expression, and say one word to a stranger. And read 2,000 comments beneath it in which people who had never met him had constructed, out of 9 seconds. A man of enormous discipline and mysterious purpose. Nobody guessed money. Not one person out of 2,000 guessed money. Ethan closed the phone and set his kitchen and understood 2 things at once. The first was that he had, without intending to, acquired an audience. The second was that an audience was worth something, and that he had spent 18 months solving the problem of how to make a difficult thing harder. And that there was a version of this where other people paid him as well. He did not act on it that night. He went out and did the evening session, 40 kilos, in the dark. Because the multiplier was good, and because by then it genuinely did not occur to him to do anything else with an evening. But the thought had arrived, and thoughts of that kind, in Ethan Cole, did not leave. The blizzard came in on a Thursday in the second week of February. And the city did what cities do, which was stop. The trains went first, then the buses. Schools closed at 11. By 2 in the afternoon the radio had begun using the phrase unnecessary travel. And by 4 the roads had emptied of everything except the occasional council truck laying grit that the weather removed within the hour. Ethan stood at the window of a flat he had finally, at his accountant's insistence, bought rather than rented, and watched the street disappear. He had been running in cold weather for over a year by then. He knew the numbers. 2 degrees paid roughly triple summer rates. Below 0 with wind was better. Sleet was better than snow because sleet soaked you, and a soaked man loses heat far faster. And losing heat meant the body had to work to make it, and work was what got paid. He had never seen anything like what the panel showed him that afternoon. Potential environmental multiplier times 6.2. He read it several times. 6.2. Not the 2.8 he got on a hard winter morning. Not the 4.1 he had managed once, in November, in freezing rain. On a night that had frightened him slightly. 6.2. His 90-minute session, at 40 kilos at 6.2, was worth $91,000. Ethan looked out at a street where the snow was coming sideways past a streetlight, and where no human being had walked for 2 hours. And he felt something that he recognized, distantly, as the same feeling he had had in the sauna. And this time he was sober enough to check it. Because the sauna had felt exactly like this, certain obvious, free money. He made himself sit down and do it properly, on paper, the way he did everything now. The sauna had been wrong because it asked nothing of him. This asked everything. That was the difference, and it was the whole difference. A blizzard is not free money. A blizzard is the most expensive possible way to earn. And the system was offering 6.2 precisely, because there was a real and calculable chance that the man who went out into it would not come back. So he priced that too. He put on everything he owned. Thermal base, wind shell, the 40-kilo vest under the shell rather than over it, so it did not catch the wind like a sail. He took 2 hydration gels and an electrolyte concentrate. He set a timer on his phone for 40 minutes and told himself that when it went, he turned around. And that this was not negotiable, and that the number would still be there tomorrow. Then he went out into it. It was, he would say later, the best hour of his life. And he was never entirely sure whether that was a good thing to be true about a person. The city was gone. Not quiet. Snow does something to a street that removes the parts of it that are recent. And what was left was the shape of the place underneath, the walls and the trees and the hill. And Ethan Cole ran through the middle of it at 11 o'clock at night carrying 40 kilos, alone, in weather that had closed a city. And the panel kept pace beside him counting money he could not spend and did not care about. He turned at 40 minutes. He was disciplined about it. He got home at 10 past midnight with ice in his eyebrows and his hands shaking too much to work the door. And he stood in a hot shower for 20 minutes and then sat on the bathroom floor wrapped in 2 towels and read the total. $108,000. In one session. He had earned in 80 minutes what he had in the entire first month. What he did not know, and would not know for another 2 days, was that at approximately 11:04 the evening, a man on the 4th floor of a block on the far side of the park had been unable to sleep, had gone to his window, and had seen something moving on the path below. He had filmed 41 seconds of it on a phone, through double glazing, in near total darkness. The footage is terrible. You can barely make out a figure. What you can make out is that it is a human being, that it is running, and that the snow is coming down so hard that the figure vanishes and reappears twice within the clip. He captioned it, "This psycho has been running through the blizzard for 3 hours." He was wrong about the 3 hours. It did not matter. By Saturday morning it had 100,000 views. By Sunday night it had 1 million. By the following Wednesday it had 7 million and had been reposted with new captions in 4 languages. And the comments underneath were the strangest thing Ethan had ever read about himself. Who is this guy? Is he training for the apocalypse? Bro does not feel cold. There is a man in this city who has decided the weather is a personal matter. Ethan watched the clip perhaps 30 times. He could not see his own face. Nobody could. That was the only reason it took another 4 months for anyone to work out who he was. He should have been alarmed. He examined himself for alarm and did not find any, and what he found instead was a small and unfamiliar warmth. And it took him most of an evening to identify it, and when he did he felt slightly ashamed. 7 million people had watched him do the thing. Not the money. The thing itself, the running, the going out when everybody else stayed in. Ethan had been alone with this for 19 months. He had not told one person. He had lost a birthday, a friendship, and every invitation he used to get, and he had explained none of it to anybody, because the explanation was impossible. And now 7 million strangers had seen 41 seconds of it, understood nothing whatsoever about it, and had decided he was magnificent. He sat with that for a long time. Then he opened a laptop and, for the first time since a spreadsheet in July, started a document with nothing to do with multipliers. And at the top of it he wrote a list of things a person would need in order to film themselves properly in bad weather. The first video Ethan posted himself was 4 minutes of a man running up a hill in the rain carrying a weighted vest. Shot on a tripod he had to go back for twice. It was not good. He knew it was not good. There was no music, no editing to speak of. And he did not say anything for the first 90 seconds, because it had not occurred to him that he would need to. It got 240,000 views in a week. The second one he thought about more. He filmed a session properly, from 3 angles, and talked through what he was doing. And near the end, out of breath, on a hill, he said the thing that would follow him for the rest of his life. He said, if the workout feels easy, make it harder. He meant it absolutely literally. He meant that his multiplier was sliding, that easy work paid less. That the moment a session stopped costing him, he needed to add weight or distance or weather, because otherwise his income fell. It was to him a statement about arithmetic. It was practically an accounting note. 4 million people heard of philosophy. Within a fortnight there were edits of it. Ethan watched a video of himself, slowed down, in black and white, with a piano underneath, saying 8 words about a spreadsheet problem, and the comments were people describing what had helped them get through. Odorless, a man who wrote 3 paragraphs about his father. Ethan read all of them. He read them for 2 hours and then he closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while. And what he felt was not pride and was not guilt exactly, but was in the neighborhood of both. He had not lied. That was what he kept coming back to. Every word of it was true. The advice was even good advice. It had made him, by any measure, an extraordinary athlete. It was simply that the reason underneath it was not the reason anybody thought. They thought he was disciplined. He was being paid. They thought he had conquered something. He was managing a depreciating asset. By June, he had 1.2 million followers and had accepted that this was now a second job. So he did what he always did, which was treat it like a business. He learned to edit. He hired a man called Thomas who was 19 and understood cameras and who became, over the following 2 years, something close to a friend, largely because Thomas asked no questions about anything except framing. The content was easy, because the content was just his life: extreme running, endurance challenges, weighted work, cold training, cycling absurd distances, climbing. He never had to invent anything. He simply pointed a camera at what he was doing anyway, and the doing was the strangest thing most people had ever seen. Nobody guessed. That was the part that never stopped being funny. There were, eventually, thousands of theories about Ethan Cole, and he read a great many of them. He was ex-military. He had a terminal diagnosis and was refusing to say so. He was in recovery from something, and this the replacement. He had lost somebody. He was doing it for a charity he was too modest to name. The theory he saw most often was that he had been through something terrible and had come out the other side with a kind of clarity, and that the training was how he held on to it. He never corrected any of it. He could not. In September, he was in a coffee shop, sitting down, which was rare, and a man 2 tables away stood up to leave and was wearing a hoodie with white lettering across the chest. IFITASESY. Make it high ardinar. Ethan looked at it for a moment too long, and the man noticed and glanced down at his own chest, and then back up. And there was a half-second where Ethan watched him nearly recognize the face, and then decide that it was a coincidence, and leave. He sat there afterwards with a coffee going cold. Somebody had printed it. Somebody had bought it. Somebody had put it on in the morning, deliberately, to carry a sentence about a sweat multiplier around a city all day, as a statement about how to live. The absurdity of it was total, and he could not tell a single person. That was, as it turned out, the actual cost. Not the money. The money was the least interesting thing about any of it by then. Not even the isolation, which he had priced 18 months earlier and paid without much argument. It was that he had become, to 2 million people, a man who stood for something, and there was nobody alive who knew what he actually was. And the gap between those two things widened by roughly 1,000 people a day. He mentioned it once, obliquely, to Thomas, while they were packing a car at 5 in the morning. He said, "Do you ever think the people watching have got the wrong idea about what this is?" And Thomas, 19 years old, coiling a cable, said, "Everyone's always got the wrong idea about everyone. You just get to see the numbers." Then he put the cable in the box and asked whether they were doing the hill or the reservoir. And Ethan said the reservoir. Because the wind was better there, and they drove out in the dark. He hit 1 million drops on the 14th of November, on a reservoir path. In the dark, at 20 past 6 in the morning. He knew it was coming. He had been watching the counter for weeks the way you watch a fuel gauge. When it went with more ceremony than the system had ever shown him. The panel flared white, which it had never done, and held for about 4 seconds. Achievement unlocked. Human waterfall. 1 million valid drops. Reward odorless sweet. Ethan stood on a path in the dark and read the words odorless sweat and felt something go loose in his chest that he had not known was tight. He had stopped thinking about the smell. That was the thing. He had stopped thinking about it the way you stop thinking about a chronic pain. Not because it went away, but because it became the floor, the baseline, the constant against which everything else was measured. He had bought a flat partly on the basis of ventilation. He had 2 washing machines. He had a car with the seats wrapped in a material he had researched for 4 hours. He had not been inside another person's home in 14 months. He had a system, worked out over 2 years, for how to stand in a lift. And now a rectangle had made it stop, for free, as a prize. He did not believe it until that evening. He did a full session, 6 hours, 40 kilos, the works. And came home and did what he had done every day for 2 years. Which was to strip in the hall, and put everything straight into a machine, and then stand in the bathroom, and smell his own forearm. Nothing, not reduced, not masked, nothing at all. A soaked shirt that smelled of wet cotton. Ethan sat down on the edge of the bath with the shirt in his hands, and cried for about 90 seconds. Which he had not done since he was 19, and then stopped, and felt extremely foolish. And then thought about it, and decided he did not. He went to Dev's the following Saturday. He had not been to Dev's in 11 months. He had run out of ways to decline that did not require explanation. And the invitations had thinned to about one a season, and this one, a 40th, a real one. With a date months in advance. He had accepted in a moment of something that was not quite courage. He arrived early, which he never did, and stood in a hallway among coats, and let a room full of people he had known for 15 years come and stand near him. Nobody drifted. That was all. Nobody drifted. He stood in a warm, crowded kitchen for 4 hours and opened a window, and nobody found an excuse, and a woman he had known since university stood close enough to show him a photograph on her phone and did not lean back. Ethan drove home at 1 in the morning and had to stop the car for a minute on a road outside town. 2 years. He had priced it at $1,100 a session and paid it without argument, and had genuinely believed, because the arithmetic was clean, that he had made a rational trade. He sat in a parked car and understood that he had been wrong in a way the spreadsheet had no column for. The system did not, of course, give him anything for that. There was no line for it, then or ever. What the system gave him was the other thing that had been sitting grayed out at the bottom of the shop since October of the previous year, and which unlocked silently at the same moment. Sweat compression 1. $2.1 million. He read the description 3 times before understood what it was offering. Not more sweat. Less. 30% less volume, with each remaining drop worth proportionally more. It took him a while to see why that was not simply a lateral move. Then he saw it, and it was so obvious he was annoyed with himself. Fluid was the constraint. It always had been. Every collapse, every cramp, every one of the $400,000 he had spent on hydration capacity had been a response to a single problem, which was that a body producing 5 liters a day is a body 4 hours from the floor. Compression did not change what he earned per unit of effort. It changed what that effort cost him in water. He bought it in December. He did his first session afterwards and came back visibly damp, rather than visibly drowned, and earned 9% more than the equivalent session in November, and finished it able to speak in full sentences. Compression 2 came at 3 million drops and cost $8 million, and took him to 50%. By the following spring, Ethan Cole could do a 6-hour session at 40 kilos in July and come like a man who had been for a brisk walk. It was, he thought, the first upgrade the system had ever sold him that made anything easier, rather than merely bigger. He was wrong about that, and he worked out why on an evening in April, standing in front of a mirror. Because what compression had actually removed was the evidence. For 2 years the cost had been visible. It had been in the soaked shirts and the ruined shoes, and the smell and the 2 washing machines and space people left around him. Every single day his body had produced a physical, undeniable, 4-liter argument about what this was doing to him, and he had been able to ignore it. But he had never been able to not see it. Now he could do 8 hours and look fine. Ethan stood in front of the mirror in a dry shirt, feeling entirely well, $3 million a month, and understood that the last thing capable of telling him he had gone too far had just been switched off, and that he had paid $8 million for the privilege. He went out and did the evening session anyway. The facility started as a shed. That is the honest beginning of it, and Ethan enjoyed telling it way later, when there were 900 employees and a magazine wanted the origin story. It was a shed in the corner of a plot outside the city that he bought in March for $140,000 because it had a hill on it. He bought the hill for the gradient. That was the entire reasoning. What went into the shed first was a treadmill that could do a 25% incline. Then a second one, because the first had a maximum speed he could exceed. Then, because he was already having the electrics done, a cold room, a walk-in chiller unit, industrial, meant for a butcher, that he ran at -4 and put a treadmill inside. That last one was the moment the thing stopped being a shed. Because a treadmill and a chiller at -4 with a 40-kilo vest produced, reliably, on demand. In any weather, at any time of year, a multiplier of 5.1. He no longer had to wait for winter. Ethan sat in a portable office in the corner of a field in July watching a screen that said 5.1. In the middle of a heat wave, and understood that he had just solved the largest structural problem in his business, which was seasonality. He built the humidity chamber next, then the wind tunnel, then the altitude room, which was the expensive one. A sealed chamber that could pull the oxygen down to the equivalent of 4,000 meters, which cost him $1.8 million and paid for itself in 9 days. By the following spring there were 6 chambers, a recovery suite, a physio and a full-time engineer called Priya, who had come from a company that built environmental test rigs in aerospace and who was, Ethan suspected, the single most competent person he had ever employed. He called it the Performance Research Center, because the alternative was calling it what it was, which was a laboratory for making one man's perspiration as expensive as possible. And then, inevitably, people wanted in. It started with Thomas, who had been filming there for a year and who asked one day, without much hope, whether he could use the cold room. Ethan said yes and thought nothing of it, and watched a 19-year-old with no athletic background whatsoever get visibly, measurably fitter over 6 weeks in a way that Thomas himself found bewildering. Then a runner Ethan knew slightly from a race asked. Then that runner's coach asked, on behalf of 4 other athletes, and offered to pay. Ethan said no to that one, and then spent the night thinking about why he had said no, and could not find a good reason, and rang the man back in the morning. The truth was that the chambers worked, not because of the system. The system had nothing to do with Buddy but him. They worked because Ethan had spent 3 years, with effectively unlimited money and a monomaniacal interest, solving the problem of how to make training conditions as hard as possible in a controlled and repeatable way, which is, as it happens, exactly what elite athletic conditioning is. He had built, by accident, chasing a multiplier, one of the better environmental training facilities in the country. The first paying client was a triathlete. The second was a fell runner. By the end of that year there were 31, a waiting list, and a second site being fitted out 11 miles away, and Priya had hired 2 engineers under her. And here is where the public explanation for Ethan Cole's money finally arrived, and it arrived so naturally that he never had to construct it. He was a famous endurance athlete with 4 million followers who had built a training facility that professional athletes flew in to use. Of course he was rich. Nobody ever asked again after that. Not once, in the years that followed, did a single person look at his accounts and find them strange. Because the shape of the thing was so ordinary. Content, then a gym, then more gyms. That there was nothing to see. The one exception was Dev. They were in a car park in October, after a run that Dev had insisted on, and had regretted at the 4-kilometer mark. And Dev was sitting on a bollard getting his breath back, and he said, without preamble, in the way he always had, "You were already rich before the first gym opened." Ethan said investments. Dev said what investments? And Ethan, who had been waiting 11 months for a good enough opening, said sweat equity. Dev looked at him for a long moment. He said that's not what that phrase means. Ethan said no. And Dev, who had known him since they were 19, who had told him to his face that he smelled like a horse in a garage, who had watched him disappear for 2 years and come back inexplicably wealthy and inexplicably enormous, looked at his oldest friend for a while longer and then decided, visibly, to let it go. He said, "You'd tell me if you were in trouble." Ethan said, "I'm not in trouble." Which was true, and which was not an answer, and both of them knew it, and Dev got up off the bollard and said right, and they walked back to the cars. The gyms were Priya's idea, which Ethan always said publicly and which was true. She put it to him in a meeting in the 2nd year of the facility. In the flat way she put everything. That they had built 6 environmental chambers and a recovery protocol that 31 professional athletes were paying for. That none of it was patented or particularly secret. And that if they did not open it to the public then within 2 years, somebody else would open a worse version and own the category. Ethan said, "I don't want to run a gym chain." Priya said, "You already run one. It has 1 site and 31 members and a 2-year waiting list. The only decision in front of you is whether it stays small on purpose." The first public site opened 11 months later, in the city. And it was not a gym in any sense a normal person would recognize. There were weights, because you have to have weights. But the thing people came for was the back half of the building, where there was a cold room at -5. A heat and humidity chamber that ran at 40 degrees and 90%, a wind gallery, and an altitude room that took bookings in 20-minute slots and was full from the day it opened. The marketing wrote itself, because the marketing was just true. Most gyms make exercise easier. This one made it harder, on purpose, in 6 different ways. And the man who built it had 4 million followers and a well-documented history of running through blizzards. They took 11,000 memberships in the first quarter. The second site opened 6 months after that, and the third 2 months after that. And by the end of the 3rd year, There were 19 of them across the country, and Ethan Cole had, entirely as a byproduct of trying to keep his own multiplier high, become a person who employed 600 people. The saunas were the joke, and he never stopped finding them funny, because saunas are worth almost nothing to him. Passive effort, times 0.1, the very first disappointment of his entire career. The thing that had taught him what the system actually was, on a plastic bench in a leisure center changing room. And they were the single, most profitable square meter in every building. People loved them. People who would not do 20 minutes in the cold room would happily pay a premium tier to sit in a hot cigar box. And the recovery suites, sauna, cold plunge, decent showers, somewhere to sit afterwards, drove more membership upgrades than any piece of training equipment in the estate. Ethan approved a plan, in year 4, for 11 standalone recovery centers, which were essentially very good saunas with a physio attached, and which made $40 million in their first full year. He mentioned it to Priya once, that the least profitable thing he personally did was the most prive the company sold. She said, "That's most companies. The rest of it grew the way these things grow, which is to say faster than anyone intended, and mostly because people kept asking. Hydration products, because members kept asking what he drank. Clothing, because members kept asking where the vests came from. And because it turned out that a weighted vest business is a genuinely good business when the founder is the most famous wearer of weighted vests alive. Training programs, online coaching, an app which he resisted for 2 years and which then did 900,000 subscriptions in 18 months. Then events, a race series, obstacle events, an endurance festival in its second year that drew 14,000 entrants. And 2 international sites, then 5. Then a country he had never visited, buying a franchise license for a sum that his lawyer had to read to him twice. By the 5th year, the public story of Ethan Cole was completely coherent and required no maintenance whatsoever. Extreme athlete becomes viral phenomenon. Viral phenomenon builds training facility. Training facility becomes gym chain. Gym chain becomes his empire. Man is now rich. Every step of it was visible, documented, and boring. Journalists wrote it up several times and nobody ever found anything, because there was nothing to find, as the strange part was not in the accounts. The strange part was that the founder's personal income, which never appeared in any of it, exceeded the entire company's revenue for the first 4 years. Nobody looked, because why would anybody look? The suspicions that did surface were never institutional. They were always personal, and they were always from people who had known him before, and they never went anywhere, because the alternative explanation was unavailable to a reasonable mind. His mother asked, at Christmas in the 4th year, in a kitchen, drying a plate, whether he was happy. He said yes. She said that was not what she had asked, and he said he knew, and she let it go. Because she was that kind of parent, and because he was 31, and there is a limit. A journalist got closer than anybody in year 5. She had done the accounts properly, and she came to an interview with a question that Ethan could see comment from about 4 minutes out. She said the numbers work now. They didn't in the first 2 years. You were spending at level content income doesn't cover. Where was that coming from? Ethan said prize money and appearance fees. Mostly. Some of it very cheaply for a long time. 2 of those 3 were true, and the 3rd was true in a sense so specific that he did not feel he'd lied. She looked at him for a moment, and then wrote it down, and moved on. Because a man who ran through a blizzard and now owns 19 gyms is not a mystery, he is a business story. And she had 4,000 words to file. Ethan walked afterwards into a car park, and Thomas, who by then was 24 and ran a bit, asked how it went. He said fine. And it was fine, it was always fine. That was the strange, slightly hollow discovery of the 5th year, that a secret this large, held this large, does not get harder to keep. It just stops being a secret you are keeping, and becomes a thing that is simply true about you, that nobody happens to know. He started entering races in the 4th year. And he did not do it for the prize money, because the prize money was an insult. A major ultramarathon paid $50,000 to the winner. Ethan's sweat income for the same event, across 19 hours at altitude in October, was $640,000. He won it. He gave the $50,000 to a charity that his press person selected, and that he never really looked into. And he stood on a podium in a valley with a trophy, and understood that he was the only person present who thought the trophy was the small part. He did 9 events that year and 14 the next. Marathons first, then ultras, then triathlons, then the mountain races. Then a stage race across a desert that he had been looking forward to for 11 months. The desert was the biggest disappointment of his entire career. He had modeled it obsessively. 46 degrees. 6 days. 250 kilometers, self-supported, carrying everything. He had run the projections in the humidity chamber, and he had expected, conservatively, $4.5 million. Day 1 paid $190,000. He checked the panel 3 times at the first checkpoint, standing in a tent, convinced there was an error. Environmental multiplier times 1.4, 1.4. In 46-degree heat, carrying 11 kilos of kit, 91 kilometers from anything. It took him 2 days to understand it, and when he did he was almost impressed. Heat produces sweat easily. That is what heat does. The system had been telling him this since the second week of his entire life with it. On a plastic bench in a leisure center. And he had somehow decided that a desert was different because a desert was extreme. But extremity was not the metric. It had never been the metric. The metric was how hard his body had to work to produce the sweat, and in a desert. His body did not have to work at all. The desert did it for him. He was, in the terms the system had used 2.5 years earlier, sitting in a very large sauna and walking through it. The effort multiplier was still there. He was carrying a pack across 250 kilometers, and that was real work, priced properly. But the environment, which he had expected to be the whole story, contributed almost nothing. He finished the race in 4th place and made $1.1 million and spent most of the 6 days in a state of low-grade professional annoyance. The mountain was the opposite, and the mountain was where it all came together. It was an expedition rather than a race, a 6-week thing, a technical peak in the Karakoram. An invitation from a team who wanted a name attached, and who Ethan suspected had not expected him to accept. Cold, altitude, load, steep sustained technical climbing over weeks at oxygen levels that made single movement expensive. The multipliers did not add, they stacked. He watched the panel on the summit push, at 4 in the morning, at 7,900 meters, in wind that made speech impossible. And it read high effort, cold environment, altitude difficulty, personal record, times 20.6. Ethan Cole stood near the top of a mountain in Pakistan and produced, over 11 hours, the greatest concentration of value his body would ever generate. And he was too hypoxic at the time to enjoy it, and too exhausted afterwards to celebrate it. And was, he decided later, entirely appropriate that the best day of his working life had been one he could barely remember. The expedition earned him $19 million. Somewhere on the descent. And he was never able to place exactly where. Something changed about why he was doing it. He had 11 million followers by then. He had a company that turned over 400 million a year and did not need him. He had, personally, more money than he had ever managed to find a use for, and he had recently discovered that he had stopped thinking in dollars at all. He thought in sessions. A car was a Tuesday. The house he bought for his mother was about 9 days. When the company acquired a competitor for $31 million, his private reaction had been was roughly a hard fortnight, which he understood was not a normal way to experience a corporate acquisition. And on a fixed line at 7,000 meters, moving very slowly, with everything hurting, Ethan realized that he had not once, in the whole expedition, thought about what any of it paid. He had come for the multiplier. Of course he had. He had modeled it and chased it exactly as he had chased every other number for 5 years. But standing on a mountain at 4 in the morning, what he had actually been thinking about was what he could get up it. He came home and did not train for 9 days, which was the longest he had gone since the beginning. And he was not sure whether that was recovery or something else. Then he went back to the facility and asked Priya to build him a chamber that could do cold and wind simultaneously. And she said that would cost about $6 million and asked what it was for. And Ethan, who had answered that question with the word efficiency for 5 years, stood in a corner found that the honest answer had changed. He said, I want to know how far this actually goes. The chamber Priya built him took 14 months and cost $8.4 million. And when it was finished it could hold -20 degrees, 60 km/h wind, and the oxygen content of 5,500 meters, all at once, on a treadmill that went to 30% incline. They called it Chamber 7. Everyone at the facility called it the room. In the tone people reserve for things they are slightly afraid of. Ethan used it 4 times a week for 2 years, and it was, by an enormous margin, the most productive object he ever owned. By then he had bought Sweat Compression 4, which cost $41 million and took him to 85% reduction. He could do 6 hours in the room and come out with damp hair. Each drop, by that point, was worth somewhere between $400 and $1,100 depending on conditions. He had become, in the most literal sense available, efficient. The athletes came, and that was the part he had not predicted and enjoyed the most. Because the room worked, and it worked for everybody. Priya published actual papers in actual journals with actual methodology. And within 3 years the facility had a research arm, a partnership with 2 universities, and a booking list that included national teams. An Olympic distance squad trained there for a full season. A tour team took the altitude rooms for 6 weeks. A goalkeeper spent a winter in the cold gallery rebuilding a knee and sent Ethan a shirt afterwards that hung, framed, in a corridor nobody important ever walked down. Ethan Cole, chasing a number that only he could see, had accidentally advanced the field. He found that funnier than anybody understood, and he could never explain why. Which was by then such a familiar sensation that he barely noticed it. The change in him happened slowly enough that he could not date it, and it showed up first as a refusal. Year 8. An event promoter offered a purse and appearance structure for a multi-stage race in Patagonia that have put his personal sweat income somewhere north of $500,000. On top of everything else, Ethan looked at his own recovery metrics, which he now tracked via tracked multipliers, on a dashboard Priya's team had built him, and saw that he was 11 weeks into a heavy block, that his resting heart rate had been 4 beats high for a month, and that his sleep had been degrading since March. He said no. He put the phone down and sat with what he had just done. Because 8 years earlier this exact man had run for 19.5 hours and been carried off by paramedics for $2,000. It was the first time he had ever turned down money because his body had asked him to. He got better, and after that, he built in off weeks. He stopped training in December entirely, 1 year, and the sky did not fall. His annual income went up. Because he came back in January able to work harder than he had been able to work in November. Long-term yield, not daily maximum. It was, he reflected, the single most obvious principle in any business he had ever worked in. And it had taken him 8 years and 3 hospital admissions to apply it to himself. The achievements came in a chain in those last 2 years, and he mostly read them on the treadmill without stopping. 100 million drops. Train on 5 continents. 1,000 extreme workouts. 10 million followers, then 20. $100 million earned, which arrived on an ordinary Wednesday, and which he noticed about an hour late. He was 34 when he saw the number that mattered. It was February. He had done a normal session, which for him meant 2 hours in the room at -15, with a 30-kilo load. And he had finished it, and stepped out into the corridor, and taken the towel Thomas handed him. And the panel was sitting there the way it had sat there every day for 11 years. Lifetime sweat earnings $990 million, $999,199. Ethan stood in a corridor and looked at it. $1 short. Of course it was $1 short. It had been $1 for everything. Right from the first bead coming off his forehead on a pavement in July when he was 26 years old, and at $1,100 in the bank, and no idea what was happening to him. Everything after that had been multipliers in chambers and $8.4 million rooms. But the unit had never changed. The unit was 1 drop, $1, and it always had been. He was aware of Thomas beside him, and of the corridor, and of the fact that he was not moving. A single bead of sweat came out of his hairline and went down the side of his face, past his temple, along his jaw, and hung. He did not wipe it away. He waited, it fell, plus $1. The panel flared white and held, longer than it ever had, longer than the million-drop achievement, longer than anything. Achievement unlocked. Billion-dollar body. And then, underneath it, in a line he had never seen the system produce in 11 years, system evolution available. Ethan read it twice. Below it there was a short list, and the list was not consumables, and it was not chambers and not capacity upgrades. Strength, stamina, lifespan. Convertible, it said, from accrued sweat currency, at rates to be determined. He stood in a corridor at the age of 34, an extremely wealthy man in a dry shirt. Having just been told by the thing that had shaped his entire adult life that the money had never the point of it either. That the money had been the tutorial, and that there was another list. And that everything he had spent 11 years learning about difficulty and cost, and what a body will do if you pay it enough, was about to be applied to something considerably more serious than a bank balance. Thomas said, "Everything all right?" Ethan looked at the word lifespan for a long moment. Then he handed the towel back and said, "I think I need to sit down for a minute." And he was smiling.